What if one petty HOA fine sparked a war that ended with cops saluting the wrong side, a trapped car, and a tyrant's epic downfall? Buckle up, this revenge is pure gold. Karen's scream tore through the quiet Sunday morning like a fire alarm. Her shrill voice carrying across the neighborhood as she pointed at my house and yelled that she was calling 911 because of an unpaid HOA fine. She clutched her phone like it was a weapon, pacing on the edge of my driveway while the neighbors peeked from behind curtains, hungry for drama. 30 seconds later, the world tilted on its axis because instead of just one squad car, 6 police cruisers rolled in at once, sirens blaring, tires screeching to a stop. Karen grinned wickedly, certain her victory was moments away, but the smile slid off her face as every single officer stepped out, took one look at me and my family on the porch, and saluted with rigid precision like they were honoring royalty. Karen froze mid-rant, her jaw slack, her phone dangling uselessly from her fingers as the entire neighborhood erupted in confused murmurs. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, my uncle leaned casually against the porch rail, smirked at the cops, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Morning, boys. Appreciate you showing up to deal with this false alarm." The synchronized chuckle that came from the officers made Karen stumble back like she'd been slapped. And for the first time ever, the self-proclaimed queen of HOA fines had no words, just a stunned silence that promised this war had only just begun. That was the moment I knew the gloves were off and this feud was going to end with either Karen's total humiliation or my absolute destruction. And I wasn't planning on losing. The week leading up to that chaotic morning had been nothing short of a nightmare dressed as a sitcom. It started when Karen, the self-appointed president of our HOA, decided our family owed a $500 fine for having a mailbox that was, in her words, 2 shades too cheerful for the neighborhood's color palette. The mailbox had been blue for 5 years without issue, but apparently Karen had woken up bored and chose us as her latest target. She stormed up to my porch, waving her clipboard like it was a holy decree, shouting about community standards and threatening legal action if we didn't pay immediately. I tried reasoning with her, pointing out that nowhere in the HOA handbook did it say anything about mailbox colors, but logic had no place in Karen's kingdom of chaos. She loved power the way some people love oxygen, and nothing made her happier than seeing a neighbor squirm. My dad, a man who rarely lost his temper, finally told her to take the fine and shove it somewhere the sun doesn't shine. That was the moment Karen declared war on our entire family. The following days were like living under siege. Karen plastered fake violation notices all over our fence, each more ridiculous than the last. One claimed our lawn grass was too arrogant. Another said our car was parked with hostile intent. And my personal favorite accused our wind chimes of emitting threatening tones. The woman's creativity and pettiness was unmatched. At first, we tried ignoring her antics, figuring she'd get bored, but Karen was like a mosquito on espresso, relentless, loud, and impossible to swat away. She started marching around the neighborhood, ranting about how we were ruining property values, and soon she had a small army of nosy neighbors nodding along, afraid of what would happen if they didn't. It was a ridiculous sight. Karen standing in the cul-de-sac like a general, waving violation slips like war flags, rallying her troops for battle against the supposed tyrants of blue mailboxes. Things came to a boiling point when she tried to publicly humiliate us at the HOA meeting. She stood up, clutching a giant poster board covered in photos of our house, dramatically circling the mailbox like it was a crime scene. She demanded the entire HOA vote to triple our fine and threatened that if they didn't, she'd personally ensure that anyone siding with us would feel the consequences. But what Karen didn't expect was my little sister quietly recording the whole thing on her phone. My sister uploaded that video online and within hours the internet had crowned Karen as the reigning HOA queen of madness. Memes were popping up left and right. Neighbors were laughing behind her back. And even the HOA treasurer muttered under his breath that he was sick of her nonsense. That humiliation lit a fire under Karen's already unstable temper and she decided to take things nuclear. The next morning, I caught her pacing at the end of our driveway, phone in hand, muttering about calling the cops because we hadn't paid her made-up fine. I laughed, thinking there was no way she'd actually do it. I was wrong. She dialed 911 with theatrical urgency, reporting a dangerous and aggressive homeowner refusing to comply with neighborhood safety regulations, as if our blue mailbox was a ticking bomb. Minutes later, the first squad car showed up, followed by another and another until half the local force was parked outside my house. Karen's grin was wide enough to split her face in two. She strutted toward the officers like she was leading them into battle, spinning her story about how we were a menace to the neighborhood, how she feared for her safety, how this fine was crucial for community harmony. But the universe had plans for a plot twist Karen couldn't have seen coming in a million years. You see, my late grandfather had been the most beloved police chief this town had ever known. Every officer on duty that day had trained under him or been inspired by his legacy. To them, our family wasn't a nuisance. It was a name they respected. When they saw us standing on the porch, they immediately dropped the usual protocol, lined up and saluted, their voices uniting in a "good morning, sir," aimed at my dad. The look on Karen's face was pure gold, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as she realized her call for backup had backfired spectacularly. What happened next cemented the fact that this feud had crossed into legendary territory. Karen tried to scream about us being criminals, but one of the officers politely asked for proof of her accusations. She sputtered nonsense about HOA regulations, which made the officers exchange amused glances before explaining that HOA rules aren't exactly law enforcement matters. The more Karen screeched, the deeper she dug her own grave, and the neighborhood watched like it was the best free reality show they'd ever seen. My uncle, never one to miss an opportunity for a well-timed jab, leaned over the porch railing and loudly thanked the officers for keeping the community safe from mailbox color terrorism. The cops laughed. The neighbors laughed. Karen's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. That was the moment I decided this wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. Karen had dragged my entire family through public humiliation, fake fines, and police drama just to feed her craving for control. If she wanted a war, I'd give her one, but not the kind she was expecting. My revenge wasn't going to be petty. It was going to be smart, thorough, and unforgettable. And when it was done, Karen wouldn't just regret ever calling 911. She'd regret the day she thought she could mess with my family and win. The morning after the 911 fiasco, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet, like the calm before a hurricane, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what Karen would do next. She had been publicly humiliated, her credibility shredded in front of half the block and an entire squad of police officers. But if there was one thing I had learned about Karen, it was that she didn't retreat. She doubled down. I caught sight of her through my kitchen window, pacing like a caged tiger on her porch, phone glued to her ear, gesturing wildly as if plotting the next stage of her campaign against my family. My gut told me she wasn't going to stop at fake fines anymore. Sure enough, by noon, the first new violation notice appeared on our front gate, slapped there with more force than necessary, accusing us of lowering the neighborhood's value by hosting unregulated family gatherings. It was laughable, considering the so-called gatherings she was referring to had been 3 of my cousins stopping by to drop off cookies the night before. But Karen wasn't interested in logic, only in creating chaos. She tried to turn the entire HOA against us that week, throwing together an emergency meeting in her driveway where she stood on a plastic lawn chair like some kind of dictator addressing her loyal subjects. She ranted about how we were destroying the community, how we had disrespected her authority by laughing off her fines, and how if the HOA didn't act now, they would lose control of the neighborhood forever. The problem for Karen was that her rants sounded less like a speech and more like a toddler's tantrum to anyone with a brain. Several neighbors who had long been afraid of her started exchanging skeptical looks, whispering among themselves, realizing maybe they didn't have to live under her thumb anymore. I watched from my own porch, sipping lemonade, pretending not to notice, while secretly enjoying every second of her empire starting to crack. But Karen wasn't about to let her iron grip slip without a fight. 2 days later, we found our mailbox plastered in fluorescent orange stickers warning of imminent property seizure due to unpaid fines. Karen had forged some kind of ridiculous HOA court order, complete with a fake stamp she must have made on her printer. My dad nearly choked on his coffee, laughing at the absurdity. But underneath the humor, there was anger, too. This woman had dragged us through a circus of lies and intimidation tactics all because we refused to bow to her power trip. Mom wanted to confront her immediately, but Dad said, no, not yet. Because the more Karen dug her own grave, the easier it would be to bury her nonsense for good. I couldn't help thinking he was right. But a part of me wanted to strike back just to see that smug look on her face vanish again. Karen wasn't content just with stickers and fake orders. She began sending anonymous letters to the city complaining about imaginary code violations on our property. We'd wake up to inspectors at the door only for them to look around, scratch their heads, and leave, muttering about wasting their time. It became a running joke in our house to take bets on what the next fabricated violation would be. My favorite was the claim that our front porch light was a public hazard to migrating birds. A complaint so ludicrous the city official who came to check it out couldn't stop laughing. But each failed attempt only seemed to fuel Karen's fury. Her face was a permanent shade of crimson. Her eyes wild like she was losing control of not just the situation but her own sanity. She started stomping around the neighborhood at all hours, muttering about us under her breath, cornering anyone who would listen to her twisted version of events, spinning tales of us as dangerous criminals bringing ruin to her perfect suburban kingdom. Then came the HOA meeting that flipped the script entirely. Karen had called it with the intention of shaming us publicly again, waving her stack of fake fines like evidence in a high-profile trial. She strutted into the community center that night, dressed like she was about to deliver a presidential address. Flanked by two of her usual sidekicks who nodded like trained bobbleheads at every word she said. But this time, instead of rolling over, I decided to fight fire with fire. I waited until she launched into her usual tirade, complete with exaggerated gasps and fake tears about how our family was destroying the spirit of the neighborhood before I stood up calm and collected and asked if anyone would like to see the truth. My little sister, already a legend after the last video she posted, had prepared a new montage showing every ridiculous notice Karen had plastered on our property, every unhinged rant she had made in public, and even a few choice clips of her screaming at passing joggers for stepping half an inch onto her lawn. The room erupted in laughter as the video played on the projector, neighbors clutching their sides while Karen's face grew paler by the second. By the time the lights came back on, the tide had turned completely. Several people who had always been silent under Karen's rule started voicing their support for us, questioning why they had to put up with her antics in the first place. Karen tried to regain control, yelling about doctored videos and personal vendettas, but her voice was drowned out by chuckles and murmurs of dissent. One neighbor even dared to point out that the HOA handbook had no rule against colorful mailboxes, exposing the whole origin of this feud as a sham. It was the first time I saw real cracks in Karen's carefully constructed facade of authority. The first time she looked like she understood that maybe, just maybe, her reign of terror was slipping. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. And when she stormed out of that meeting red-faced and shaking with rage, I knew this wasn't over. She was plotting something bigger, something that would make the police salute incident look like a warm-up act. That night, as our family sat around the kitchen table, the mood was a mix of relief and anticipation. We'd won a small battle, publicly exposed Karen for the tyrant she was, but we all knew she wasn't done. People like her didn't stop until they were forced to. And if the past week had shown me anything, it was that Karen's obsession with control had no limits. Dad leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful glint in his eye, and said he had an idea, a way to not just defend ourselves, but turn the tables permanently. He didn't say what it was yet, only that it would take patience, planning, and a willingness to let Karen dig her own hole deeper. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible revenge scenario. From filling her yard with pink flamingos to legally buying out the land under her nose. What I didn't know then was that this feud was heading toward an explosive twist no one on the block would ever forget. A move so brilliant and humiliating that it would make Karen's 911 call fiasco look like child's play compared to what was coming next. The morning sun had barely risen when Karen decided it was time for her next masterpiece of chaos. Only this time, she was aiming for a bigger stage and higher stakes than ever before. My family and I had just sat down for breakfast when we noticed her pacing at the end of our driveway again, phone glued to her ear, glancing toward our house with a mixture of fury and anticipation like a villain preparing for her final act. It didn't take long to figure out what she was doing because moments later, just like that unforgettable Sunday morning, a police siren wailed in the distance. This time though, Karen wasn't just calling in a bogus complaint. She was staging a full-blown emergency, screaming into the phone about a violent homeowner refusing to comply with neighborhood laws and threatening the peace of the entire block. My dad shook his head, half amused, half furious, as we watched her throw herself to the ground in dramatic fashion, crying fake tears and pointing toward our house like we were holding a siege inside. It was absurd theater, the kind of thing you'd expect from a bad soap opera. But Karen wasn't acting for entertainment. She was acting because in her warped mind, this was the moment she would finally crush us under the weight of her fabricated authority. Within minutes, squad cars poured onto the street again, sirens blaring, lights flashing, and neighbors stepping outside to witness round 2 of the great HOA war. Karen scrambled to her feet, rushing toward the first officer with exaggerated sobs, spinning her story about how we were dangerous, how our refusal to pay her fine was threatening her life, how she feared for her children even though everyone knew she didn't have any. She begged the police to take us away to finally restore order to her beloved HOA kingdom. The scene was so ridiculous that my little sister whispered under her breath that we should sell tickets next time because this was better than cable TV. But the punchline came when the officers glanced at Karen, then looked at our porch, saw my father standing there calm as ever, and immediately recognized the name on our mailbox. It turned out Karen had made a fatal mistake this time. The officer in charge wasn't just a rookie, unaware of the past. He had served under my late grandfather for years, trained by him, mentored by him, and respected our family like his own. He called out a friendly greeting to my dad as though they were old friends catching up over coffee. And once again, the entire squad lined up and saluted, their voices booming, "A good morning, sir." That echoed down the street. The color drained from Karen's face as she realized history was repeating itself, only this time worse because her attempt was more desperate, more theatrical, more obviously fake than before. One officer asked her calmly to explain what danger she believed she was in, and Karen launched into an incoherent rant about mailbox colors, community harmony, and supposed threats that no one had witnessed. The officer raised an eyebrow, glanced toward our house, and then back at Karen with the kind of look you'd give someone claiming to be abducted by aliens while standing in their front yard. As the crowd of neighbors grew, the truth of the situation started to sink in for everyone watching. Karen had called 911 again, not because of danger, not because of a crime, but because she couldn't stand the idea of losing control. A few bold neighbors even started filming, whispering commentary about how Karen was losing her grip on reality. And the humiliation on her face was something I'll never forget. Still, Karen refused to back down. She stomped toward the officers, shouting that they were ignoring a threat, that we were dangerous rule breakers ruining her perfect community. She jabbed her finger toward me, screaming that I had cursed at her, that I had damaged her property, even though she couldn't produce a shred of evidence. My uncle, leaning against the porch railing with a grin, called out in a voice loud enough for the whole block to hear. "Karen, you forgot to rehearse this scene. You're stumbling over your lines." The crowd erupted in laughter, and that was the final nail in her coffin for that morning. The officer finally told Karen she needed to calm down and explained that making false emergency calls was a crime in itself. That single sentence changed everything. Karen went from furious tyrant to panicked victim in a heartbeat, insisting she was misunderstood, that she was just worried for the neighborhood, that she hadn't meant to waste police time. But it was too late. The officers had had enough. They issued her an official warning for filing a false report, and one even suggested that if she kept it up, she could face serious charges. The sight of Karen standing there stammering, face red, tears smeared down her cheeks, surrounded by a crowd filming her every move was a sight of poetic justice. My family savored in silence. After the police left, the neighborhood felt different. People weren't just laughing at Karen anymore. They were starting to turn on her, whispering about how unhinged she had become, questioning why they had ever let her run the HOA unchecked. The fear she had thrived on for years was cracking, replaced by ridicule, and Karen could feel it slipping away. That's why later that evening, she decided to go nuclear. We caught her sneaking around the side of our property with a phone pressed to her ear, whispering urgently to someone about how she had connections who could make our lives miserable. My dad quietly stepped outside, caught her red-handed, and asked if she was lost. The look on her face was pure panic before she scurried back to her house like a startled raccoon slamming the door behind her. But that was the night everything changed because in the chaos, my cousin, who worked in city planning, dropped by with news that made us all sit up straighter. He revealed Karen had a history of abusing her position, not just against us, but against multiple families in the neighborhood. She had filed false reports before, manipulated HOA rules for personal gain, and even embezzled funds meant for community project. There were whispers that the city had already started sniffing around her activities, but hadn't had enough evidence to act. That was when my dad leaned forward, his voice low but steady, and said it was time to stop letting Karen set the rules of this game. If she wanted to drag us through hell, we were going to take her hand and lead her straight into the fire she'd built for everyone else. From that moment, the tone shifted. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were planning. We started documenting every single thing Karen did, every fake notice, every absurd fine, every unhinged rant. We quietly collected statements from neighbors who were finally willing to speak out, screenshots of emails Karen had sent threatening families, and even video footage of her trespassing on properties at night. Each new piece of evidence wasn't just a weapon. It was a brick in the wall we were building to corner her once and for all. She thought calling 911 would scare us, break us, make us kneel to her HOA crown. Instead, it handed us the ammunition to dismantle her empire piece by piece. And though she didn't know it yet, the day was coming when the entire neighborhood, the police, and even the city would see Karen for what she really was. And when that day came, no fake fine, no scream, no frantic phone call would save her from the storm she had started. The days following Karen's second failed 911 stunt felt like living inside a pressure cooker. The entire neighborhood buzzing with rumors about her meltdown while she retreated into her house like a cornered animal plotting her next strike. We could see her through the blinds, pacing endlessly, shouting into her phone, typing furious emails that probably accused us of causing global warming by owning a blue mailbox. But beneath the humor, there was a tangible tension, a sense that Karen had reached a point of no return and wouldn't stop until one of us had completely broken. That's when Dad gathered us around the table one evening and laid out the plan that would change the game forever. He explained that if Karen wanted to use false fines and bogus rules as weapons, we'd fight back with facts, patience, and precision. This wasn't about pranks or screaming matches anymore. It was about dismantling her false empire in a way so airtight that when she finally fell, there would be no getting back up. We agreed on one thing immediately. The first step was gathering irrefutable proof of her corruption, not just against us, but every neighbor she had bullied for years, and turning that evidence into a sword sharp enough to cut her reign of terror to ribbons. The operation began subtly, like a quiet rebellion. We set up discreet cameras to capture Karen's frequent trespassing, her habit of wandering into yards at night with her clipboard like a self-appointed sheriff, searching for violations only she could see. My little sister scoured neighborhood group chats, pulling screenshots of Karen threatening fines for trivialities like having a welcome mat that wasn't HOA approved or kids' bicycles leaning against a fence. My cousin reached out to families who had long been too afraid to speak up. And to our surprise, many were eager to share their own horror stories once they realized they weren't alone anymore. One elderly couple revealed that Karen had extorted hundreds from them by claiming their flowers violated color guidelines she had invented on the spot. Another family showed us fake letters with city logos crudely copied and pasted, warning of inspections that never actually happened. With every piece of information collected, the picture of Karen's tyranny grew clearer and uglier, turning her from a neighborhood nuisance into a full-blown tyrant running a one-woman racket under the HOA's name. While this quiet investigation was underway, Karen escalated her efforts to provoke us. She had apparently convinced herself that the reason we hadn't cracked under her latest antics was because she wasn't being harsh enough. She began sending multiple notices a day, each one more ridiculous than the last. One claiming our garden hose was strategically placed to mock HOA regulations. Another declaring our house numbers were too large and causing psychological distress to passers-by. We laughed, sure, but each stunt added weight to the growing dossier of her insanity. And when Karen realized she wasn't getting a rise out of us, she turned her attention to the rest of the block, stomping around in her slippers at dawn, berating neighbors for having curtains that clashed with her aesthetic vision of perfection. Slowly, people stopped avoiding eye contact with us out of fear, and started joining quiet conversations in support of the plan we were building. Karen's power, which once thrived on fear and intimidation, was slipping through her fingers without her even realizing it. One night, while the neighborhood slept, Dad, my uncle, and I spread out across the cul-de-sac, leaving small envelopes in the mailboxes of every home except Karen's. Each envelope contained a summary of what we had gathered so far along with screenshots, photos, and evidence of funds Karen had siphoned from HOA dues into her personal account for administrative expenses that mysteriously matched the cost of her new backyard spa. We didn't include threats or accusations, just the truth laid bare, and by morning, the effect was explosive. People began confronting her publicly, demanding answers about missing money, asking where the supposed community improvements she'd promised had gone. Karen tried to shout them down, claiming we had fabricated everything, but her panic stammering and the undeniable proof in everyone's hands turned the tide completely. The woman who had once strutted around like a queen was now a cornered con artist trying to plug leaks in a sinking ship. Realizing the neighborhood was no longer under her thumb, Karen made a desperate gamble. She called for a special HOA board meeting to reinstate her control, promising to reveal damning evidence against our family that would expose us as liars and troublemakers. We attended the meeting prepared for whatever circus act she had planned. But what she unveiled was laughable, even by Karen's standards. She held up grainy photoshopped pictures of our house supposedly violating rules that didn't exist. A blurry image of me supposedly vandalizing her lawn that was clearly taken from a stock photo online. And a forged city citation riddled with spelling errors that had the entire room snickering. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice or throw insults. I simply clicked play on a projector that displayed real videos of Karen trespassing, harassing neighbors, forging documents, and screaming threats at residents who dared question her. By the time the video ended, the room was dead silent, except for Karen's frantic breathing. One by one, the board members who had always backed her nodded grimly and announced they would be launching a formal investigation into her actions. Karen stormed out of the meeting, shaking with rage. But the damage was done. For the first time in years, she wasn't feared. She was pitted or mocked. Yet, even as she retreated, we all knew someone like Karen didn't just crawl away and accept defeat. That night, from my bedroom window, I saw her sitting in her car under the street lamp, gripping the steering wheel, her face twisted with fury, and I knew she was plotting something reckless. But what she didn't know was that we were plotting something too. A move so perfectly legal, so undeniably final that when it came, she wouldn't just lose her grip on the HOA. She'd lose every ounce of false power she'd ever held over us. We had already started working on acquiring a narrow strip of land she had long assumed was public space, a forgotten patch she used daily to park her car. The paperwork was already in motion, quiet and unseen. And when it was done, Karen would wake up to find herself trapped, both literally and figuratively, in a cage of her own making. And as I lay in bed that night, thinking about everything she had put this neighborhood through, I decided that when the time came to close the trap, we weren't just going to make a point. We were going to make history, delivering a kind of justice so sharp, so satisfying that no one would ever dare pull another Karen stunt in this neighborhood again. The decision to buy that narrow, forgotten strip of land behind Karen's house was the turning point in this war, the moment we stopped playing defense and prepared the checkmate move that would end her reign of terror once and for all. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment idea. My dad, uncle, and cousin spent nights poring over old property records, dusty maps, and overlooked land deeds until they found it. A tiny sliver of earth that Karen had used for years as her personal parking spot without ever realizing it wasn't part of her property. It was technically for sale due to a clerical oversight decades ago, and all it took was a few quiet calls, a discreet meeting with the city clerk, and a signed check to make it ours legally. We didn't celebrate right away, though, because this plan had to be executed with perfect timing and absolute precision. Karen had dragged our family through hell with her fabricated rules, phony fines, false emergency calls, and endless harassment. So, when we finally struck back, we wanted it to be public, legal, undeniable, and devastating enough to ensure she never dared to wield fake power over anyone again. We started small, making sure Karen didn't suspect a thing. Every morning, she continued to park her car on what she thought was her land, stomping past our house with her usual glares and muttered insults, completely oblivious to the fact that her days of strutting around like the queen of the cul-de-sac were numbered. While she wasted time drafting new violation notices accusing us of crimes like aggressively planting tulips and sidewalk loitering, we quietly prepared for the day of reckoning. My uncle arranged for fencing supplies to be delivered under the guise of a landscaping project. My cousin got official permits signed and approved for a fence installation, and I started mapping out exactly where the structure would go, making sure every inch of Karen's precious parking spot would be sealed off without a single law broken. It was a masterpiece of patience, and every moment Karen spent tormenting other neighbors just made the eventual reveal sweeter in my imagination. Meanwhile, Karen's desperation to regain control of the neighborhood reached new heights. She had lost most of her blind followers after the HOA board meeting exposed her antics, but she still roamed the streets like a dethroned monarch searching for an army to command. She began screaming at delivery drivers, threatening kids on bikes for riding too close to her lawn, and even sent a furious letter to the city claiming our entire block was a hostile environment in need of urgent government intervention. The letter was so unhinged it went viral online after someone leaked it, making Karen an internet laughingstock for the second time. This only added fuel to her fire. She started camping out on her porch, binoculars in hand, convinced that we were plotting against her, too paranoid to notice that every nail, every board, every legal document for the upcoming fence had already been lined up perfectly behind the scenes. As the day of the build approached, tension in the neighborhood grew thick. Some neighbors, now fully on our side, whispered encouragement every time they passed, asking if we were finally going to give Karen a taste of her own medicine. Others just smiled knowingly, sensing something big was coming. Even the local cops, who had become all too familiar with Karen's antics, gave us a nod when they drove by, as if to say they wouldn't mind seeing her finally outsmarted. Karen remained blissfully ignorant, still parking her car on that strip of land every night, still believing she was untouchable despite the fact that the ground beneath her tires no longer belonged to her. The morning of the trap's construction felt electric, like the countdown to a long-awaited finale. At dawn, before most of the neighborhood was awake, we rolled out fencing panels and posts, setting them neatly beside the strip of land. Karen was still asleep, her car sitting there like a trophy waiting to be claimed. Dad triple-checked the permits, making sure everything was by the book, while my uncle drilled the first post into the soil with a grin that spoke volumes about how long he had been waiting for this moment. As the sun rose higher, curious neighbors began to gather, whispering and filming, knowing they were about to witness a legendary HOA showdown. We worked fast but careful, every nail hammered with purpose, every panel locked into place with a kind of righteous precision. By the time Karen's front door finally creaked open, rubbing her eyes and clutching her coffee mug, the fence was already halfway up, and her car was parked neatly inside what was now undeniably legally our property. The first few seconds were priceless. Karen stared, blinking as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing, then stumbled toward us, screeching like a banshee about how we had no right, how this was her land, her space, her rules. Dad didn't say a word, just handed her a copy of the property deed with our name on it and a copy of the permit signed by the city allowing the fence installation. The look on Karen's face shifted from confusion to horror to rage as she realized there was nothing she could do. Every scream, every threat of lawsuits, every wild accusation she hurled bounced off the wall of legal paperwork we had prepared like bullets against armor. The neighbors couldn't contain their laughter as Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of HOA enforcement, was suddenly powerless, standing on someone else's property, screaming like a trespasser begging for mercy. She tried calling the police again, her go-to weapon, convinced they would force us to tear down the fence. But when the officers arrived, they took one look at the documents, glanced at Karen's red face and frantic gestures, and then looked at me and said calmly, "Ma'am, this is private property now. You're trespassing." The collective gasp from the gathered crowd was followed by laughter and applause as Karen's voice cracked in disbelief. She stomped her feet, pointed wildly at the fence, shrieked about conspiracies and forged papers, but every word just dug her deeper. The officers reminded her that interfering with a legal construction project could get her fined or even arrested. That was the moment Karen broke, screaming so loudly, dogs barked 3 streets over, but powerless to stop what was happening right before her eyes. We continued working silently. Each panel added like the final nails in the coffin of her so-called dominance until the fence stood tall, sturdy, and immovable, trapping her beloved car inside a cage of poetic justice. By nightfall, the entire neighborhood was celebrating as if we had won a great battle. People brought out lawn chairs, clapped us on the back, and congratulated us for doing what no one else had dared for years. Karen remained locked in her house, curtains drawn, too humiliated to face anyone after the spectacle she had just endured. But I knew this was only the beginning of the end. We had stripped her of her fake power publicly, shown the entire community that her threats meant nothing against truth and law. But there was one final act left, one last twist that would end her tyranny forever. Because while Karen could scream all she wanted about the fence and stew in her embarrassment, the city investigation into her years of HOA fraud was already underway. And when that hammer dropped, she wouldn't just lose a parking spot or her made-up fines. She'd lose everything she had built her false empire upon. The morning after we sealed Karen's car inside our newly built fence was one of the most unforgettable moments in the history of the neighborhood. I woke up to the sound of a high-pitched wail that could have doubled as a tornado siren. And when I looked out the window, there was Karen standing in her bathrobe, barefoot, circling the fence like a wild animal that had been trapped for the first time in her life. Her car was sitting there peacefully behind the locked gate, perfectly safe, yet completely unreachable, without committing trespassing or paying us to open it. The spectacle drew neighbors out of their houses one by one. Everyone clutching their coffee cups, some filming on their phones, others just smirking as Karen's meltdown unfolded in real time. It was poetic. It was hilarious, and it was only going to get better because this time Karen had absolutely no ammunition to fight back with. She rattled the fence panels, screamed about calling every lawyer in the state, shouted that this was kidnapping her car and theft of her rights. But every time she yelled some new nonsense. Dad calmly handed over the paperwork, proving every inch of that fence was legal, and every inch of the land it stood on belonged to us. The law was a wall she couldn't climb. And the humiliation of being powerless in front of the same people she had bullied for years was eating her alive. Of course, Karen couldn't survive without turning this moment into a performance. Within an hour, she had her phone out trying to live stream her unjust suffering to anyone who would watch. She painted herself as the victim of an evil conspiracy, claiming the entire HOA had turned on her and that we were criminals who had stolen her property. The comments flooding in were anything but sympathetic. People who had seen her earlier viral moments mocked her relentlessly, calling this karma, calling her the HOA queen dethroned. Some even offering to send popcorn for the show. This only fueled her meltdown. She paced and screamed, tears running down her face, voice cracking as she yelled about lawsuits and revenge, promising everyone that the police would be here any minute to force us to tear down the fence. And just like before, she picked up her phone and dialed 911 with dramatic urgency, sobbing into the receiver as though a crime of the century was unfolding. But when the officers arrived, it was clear the story was about to take a turn Karen hadn't prepared for. The same officer who had previously warned Karen about false reports stepped out of the squad car, already shaking his head as he approached. He asked calmly what the emergency was this time, and Karen launched into her script, claiming we had illegally built a fence to imprison her car, that we were violating her property rights, that this was a blatant attack on her freedom. The officer barely glanced at her before turning to us. Dad, without saying a word, handed over the signed deed, the building permit, and the property map showing beyond doubt that the land, the fence, and everything on it now legally belonged to our family. The officer read through the documents, nodded, and turned back to Karen with a tone that was part stern, part exhausted, telling her point blank that the car was now parked on someone else's property, and that if she wanted it back, she would need to request access and potentially pay towing fees if we chose to have it removed. Karen's face contorted as the entire crowd of neighbors, now doubled in size, gasped and chuckled at the irony. After years of threatening everyone else with fines and property rules, Karen was now the one trapped by a law she couldn't twist in her favor. The argument that followed was chaos personified. Karen screamed that the city would undo this injustice, that her lawyers would sue us for millions, that we were criminals ruining the sanctity of the HOA. The officer calmly reminded her that trespassing on this land would result in charges, that harassment could lead to arrest, and that repeatedly calling 911 for personal disputes could put her in real legal trouble. The realization that even the police had no intention of saving her sent Karen into a frenzy like nothing I had seen before. She threw herself to the ground, kicking and screaming, pounding the pavement with her fists like a child denied candy. All while neighbors filmed, laughed, and whispered that this was the day Karen's tyranny had finally come to an end. It was a meltdown for the ages. A tantrum so grand it would be replayed on phones and social media for weeks, and watching it from my porch felt like witnessing justice unfold in its purest, funniest form. But beneath the comedy of the moment, there was a shift in power that could be felt everywhere. For the first time in years, people weren't just laughing at Karen. They were openly defying her, telling her to leave them alone, threatening to call the city themselves if she dared to issue another fake fine. A few neighbors even came up to shake Dad's hand, thanking him for doing what they had always wanted to, but never dared, freeing them from Karen's endless harassment. It was like a weight had been lifted off the entire community's shoulders, and Karen knew it. The control she had clung to, the fear she had thrived on, was gone, replaced by ridicule and contempt. That more than losing her parking spot, more than the fence, more than the trapped car, was what truly broke her. Still, Karen wasn't done scheming. Even as the sun set and her car remained fenced in like a monument to poetic justice, we saw her sneaking calls from her porch, pacing furiously, eyes darting toward our house like she was plotting some last desperate move. She barked into the phone about getting City Hall on her side or finding a loophole. But the truth was obvious to everyone. The walls were closing in. The HOA board had already suspended her after the evidence we presented. The city had begun a deeper investigation into her misuse of funds and abuse of power. And now even her last weapon, the police she loved to call, had turned against her. The empire she built on intimidation and lies had collapsed completely, leaving only a furious woman ranting to herself in the dark while the neighborhood slowly reclaimed its peace. That night, as I stood in the yard watching the street lights flicker, I felt a mix of triumph and finality. We had played the long game and won, not just for our family, but for everyone Karen had ever terrorized. But there was one final twist yet to come. One last piece of justice that neither Karen nor anyone else on the block saw coming. Because while Karen was busy screaming about fences and false rights, the city's investigation had uncovered something far bigger than a power-hungry HOA president throwing tantrums. They had found a trail of fraud that went beyond our neighborhood, connecting Karen to HOA scams in other communities. Fake fines she had imposed for years and money she had siphoned off into private accounts. The storm that was coming for Karen now wasn't just from us. It was from the law itself. And when it hit, it would make everything we'd done so far look like child's play. As I closed the door and turned out the lights, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that the final chapter of this saga was going to be the most dramatic, the most satisfying, and the most unforgettable moment of all. The days following Karen's legendary meltdown felt eerily calm on the surface, like a brewing storm waiting to unleash chaos. The fence stood tall and unmovable, a silent monument to her defeat, while her car remained trapped behind it as though the universe itself had decided to give her a taste of the same helplessness she had inflicted on others for years. Neighbors walked past our house with knowing smiles, some stopping to thank us quietly for standing up to her tyranny, others laughing about the viral videos of Karen's screaming fit that had already spread across social media like wildfire. Yet beneath the calm, something bigger was unfolding. Something even Karen couldn't scream her way out of. The city's investigation into her HOA reign had been moving quietly in the background for weeks. But now it was heating up. Officials were digging into every fake fine she had ever issued, every dime that had mysteriously vanished from the HOA budget, every forged document and fabricated rule she had used to control this neighborhood. What they found was staggering. Karen hadn't just been tormenting us or this block. She had been running similar scams in other communities for years, moving from one HOA board to another, milking terrified residents with threats and bogus citations before slipping away when things got too hot. This time, there was nowhere left for her to run. It all came crashing down one sunny afternoon when a fleet of unmarked cars rolled into the neighborhood, parking silently in front of Karen's house. At first, everyone thought it was another one of her desperate theatrics, maybe some attempt to get law enforcement on her side again. But when men and women in suits stepped out, badges in hand, and walked straight to her door, the truth became clear. Karen wasn't about to have another fake victory. She was about to have her entire empire dismantled. The neighbors poured out onto their lawns like it was a block party. Phones ready, whispering in disbelief as federal agents knocked on Karen's door. She emerged moments later, trying to play innocent, hands fluttering in exaggerated confusion, her voice carrying across the street as she tried to charm them with claims of being a victim of harassment by unruly homeowners. But the agents weren't buying it. They had documents, warrants, and a trail of evidence long enough to stretch past this subdivision. And before Karen could even process what was happening, they were reading her rights. The collective gasp that went through the crowd was followed by silence, broken only by the sound of handcuffs clicking shut around Karen's wrists. The moment was surreal. The same woman who had strutted around this neighborhood like a self-crowned queen, handing out absurd fines, screaming about rules she made up on the spot, and calling 911 at the drop of a hat was now being escorted to a black SUV in front of the very people she had tried to control. Some neighbors clapped, others laughed, a few even whistled mockingly, and Karen's face turned from disbelief to rage to sheer panic. She screamed that this was all a setup, that we were framing her, that she'd sue every one of us for defamation. But the agents ignored her, calmly reading out the list of charges she faced: fraud, extortion, falsifying documents, misuse of HOA funds, harassment, and obstruction of justice. With every charge listed, Karen's protests grew weaker, drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd, finally witnessing true justice served. When the SUV doors closed and Karen was driven away, it was as if the entire neighborhood exhaled a breath it had been holding for years, the oppressive weight of her tyranny lifting once and for all. In the weeks that followed, life on our street transformed. Without Karen lurking around every corner, barking orders and issuing threats, people started living freely again. Kids rode their bikes without fear of being fined for reckless cycling. Families painted their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. Neighbors hosted barbecues without worrying about Karen's clipboard of doom showing up to ruin the fun. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove her permanently, and new leadership stepped in, promising transparency and fairness, even apologizing publicly for letting her run unchecked for so long. It was like a dark cloud had finally drifted away, letting sunlight touch every corner of the community she had once controlled with an iron fist and a shrill voice. As for the fence, we decided to leave it up for a while as a reminder of what had happened. A symbol of standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are. Karen's car was eventually towed off the property after she failed to claim it or pay the fees, the city declaring it abandoned since she was too busy dealing with court dates and mounting legal troubles to care about a trapped vehicle. Watching that car being hauled away felt like closing the last chapter of a long and exhausting war, a final exclamation point on a story that had started with a ridiculous fine over a blue mailbox and escalated into one of the wildest battles our town had ever seen. The trial became a spectacle of its own, drawing attention from far beyond our neighborhood. News outlets picked up the story of the HOA queen gone rogue, recounting tales of Karen's absurd rules, fake fines, and infamous police callouts, often replaying the footage of her screaming outside the fence or being arrested in handcuffs. The evidence against her was overwhelming, with witnesses from multiple neighborhoods testifying about her years of scams and intimidation. It didn't take long for the jury to find her guilty on nearly every count. And when the sentence was handed down, a hefty prison term and massive restitution payments to her victims, the entire courtroom erupted in applause. Karen's face twisted with disbelief as the gavel struck, but there was no one left to defend her. No fake rules to hide behind, no false power to wield. Her empire had crumbled, and this time there was no rebuilding it. When it was all over, we threw a block party bigger than anything the HOA had ever allowed under Karen's rule. Cops, neighbors, and friends from other communities who had once suffered under her petty tyranny came to celebrate. There was music, laughter, and a sense of freedom none of us had felt in years. Dad gave a small speech thanking everyone for standing together against fear, reminding us that bullies only win when people stay silent and that this neighborhood had proved what could happen when you fought back smartly and legally. As the sun set and lanterns lit up the street, I looked around at all the smiling faces, kids playing, dogs running free, and realized we hadn't just won a personal war. We had changed the entire spirit of the neighborhood forever. Sometimes when the night gets quiet and I sit on the porch looking at the new peaceful street, I think about Karen's face that first day when the police saluted our family instead of siding with her. The moment that started this whole insane feud, she had believed she was untouchable, that a made-up HOA rulebook and a loud voice could control anyone. But in the end, the louder she screamed, the more her lies echoed back at her until they trapped her just like that car inside our fence. Justice hadn't come overnight. It hadn't come easy, but it had come. And it came with laughter, with truth, with the kind of poetic ending you'd expect in a story no one would believe unless they'd seen it happen.